Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jennifer. It's good to be with you. It is genuinely a pleasure and an honor. You are at the beginning of a really interesting day in which you will hear from some wonderful speakers, have opportunities to interact, be motivated, and challenged. Diversity and inclusion are exciting and important, and also daunting. I'm glad that you've decided to invest a day here. My goal is to lay a foundation. I hope to do some level setting and some permission granting. In other words, to lay out some grounding principles and give you permission to ask questions, share insights, and maybe even admit to some of the things that are vexing you as you approach this work. I do it with humility, knowing that some of you know this work very well. At the end, we'll have time for conversation, and I'm looking forward to learning from you. Here's our plan. I want to ask questions and offer tentative answers. What are diversity and inclusion? Why are they hard? Why is it worth it? And what does it take to be impactful? As we explore these topics, I'll be trying to build a framework for you, a way to organize your thinking and potentially your next steps. As we begin, I want to set context. Along the way, I'm going to use some examples from my organization, which is Princeton University. You come from a range of organizations, some for-profit, nonprofit, some large, some small, many different types of business models and goals. And in making reference to Princeton, which is a large, complex organization, I am not fantasizing that you want to learn about our programs. Rather, I'll use my own institution as an example of how we struggle with and solve diversity and inclusion challenges in our setting. The point is not that you should do what Princeton does or even that Princeton does this work well. I offer my experience to you rather as an example. Secondly, whatever your professional role, whether more senior or less senior, you have agency and the power to have an impact. Each of our organizations has an internal staff and operation, and it has an external sphere of influence. You interact with colleagues, but also clients, customers, vendors, and community members. Even if your staff is quite small, your sphere of influence may be large. So I hope that the principles that we are talking about will apply to how you approach your customers and community, as well as your direct colleagues. You are empowered. Okay, let's dive in. I'm big on making sure that we are all speaking from the same point of reference. So let's start with what are diversity and inclusion. Diversity refers to the mix of identities and experiences in the group, including race, ethnicity, gender and gender identity, sexual orientation, age, national origin, disability or ability, religion or no religion, socioeconomic background, diversity of thought, family status, and so on. Diversity is often measurable demographically, but not always. Sometimes types of identity are legally protected, but not all. It is the identities and experiences that we bring to a group, not the characteristic of an individual. Inclusion is the actions and behaviors that create a fair, equitable environment in which everyone can contribute fully and thrive. It is climate and culture. Formally, inclusion is reflected in mission statements, the way clients are treated, and in what systems can be accessed if someone were to be treated unfairly or disrespectfully. Informally, inclusion is shaped by how people speak to each other, whether they feel treated with respect, and how meetings are organized, among many other things. Each of us has influence over our organization's inclusivity, at least informal. Equity, the mindset and processes that lead to fair outcomes, underlie both how we create diversity and how we create inclusion. And belonging, one of our themes for today, is a feeling of community and connection. It involves psychological security that creates trust and authenticity, and it arises from a diverse, inclusive, equitable environment. So diversity is the group that's invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, Belonging is knowing all the songs and dance moves. I had to use that analogy because it has disco balls in it, and that's just, I had to do that. One important point that I will return to multiple times is that diversity and inclusion are both personal and systemic. You have an identity made of many personal characteristics and experiences. You relate to other people one-on-one. You experience your workplace emotionally. You're not a machine. Personal. At the same time, you and your colleagues are working within systems of policies, procedures, laws and regulations, hierarchies, and so on. You may not even perceive the systems around you, which reflect norms or long-standing approaches that are rarely, if ever, questioned. Systems. On the diversity front, how you experience your race and gender is personal. How you organize a search process so that it does not discriminate is systemic. On the inclusion front, developing the cultural competencies to use respectful vocabulary is personal. How your organization gives days off for religious holidays is systemic. Here's the thing about systems. Once they are in place, they keep going, whether they are producing good outcomes or not. A bad system will sabotage all your personal good intentions unless it is purposefully interrupted. The concept of systemic racism has surfaced intensely during the past few years. And although it is new to some, it is clarifying. It is a real factor in what happens in the diversity and inclusion space. We are used to thinking about neo-Nazis as racist. We are not used to thinking about systems as racist. How can systems be racist or otherwise inequitable based on identity? Or more precisely, how can a system have a disparate impact based on identity? I want to give you an example from the university, one that our president, Christopher Eisgruber, has cited. It is a relatively low-stakes example, but it can be a useful one nonetheless, and I believe that you have to own your own stuff. So as President Eisgruber has written, modern-day Princeton inherited from earlier generations at least 9 academic departments organized around European languages and culture, but only a single, relatively small program in African studies. So Princeton has full academic departments focused on English, German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Classic, Slavic, and so on. It has no department focused on Africa, which is an entire continent, not a country. So how does this happen? The European culture departments got started in the 19th century when it was presumed that all meaningful knowledge came from the Western European tradition. And at Princeton in the 19th century, all students and faculty were white men. So no one would have considered the study of anything in Africa, apart from Egypt, to be worthwhile. Was that racist? Yes, absolutely. It reflected intellectual racism and racism in that the university in that era would never have admitted black students or hired black faculty. We're not proud of that. It was just a fact that we now live with and have to acknowledge, and that spurs us to try and do better. In the 19th century, European culture departments were established, and over the decades they grew. They hired outstanding faculty who did excellent research and advocated for their department's continued growth and relevance. The departments trained students who went on to become alumni and donors. Those donors endowed professorships in those departments in perpetuity so that they continued to grow. Those departments that received early investments continued to prove themselves, and they still thrive. In the meantime, through the 20th century, few people were advocating for the study of Africa. There were a few faculty members on campus, scattered among other departments. But if there were few courses taught, few students had the chance to get excited, and there was a cycle of low demand. And no one, therefore, endowed professorships. So we travel forward 150 years, which in the life of Princeton University is not really that long. And along the way, we became much more diverse in our student body and faculty. We added a department in African American Studies, and we do have marvelous faculty who teach about Africa. Nonetheless, we still have 9 wonderful departments focused on European languages and culture, and we still have no department focused on Africa. There is no one on campus who hates Africa or people of African descent or who is trying to block the creation of a department. There is no active racism involved. We are dealing with an artifact from the past that simply remains. An example of the way that racism created a systemic inequity that stays with us and arguably is still undermining us. All of our students, whatever their race, miss out when they don't have the opportunities to study Africa as they deserve. We do have faculty who study Africa, of course, but they miss opportunities to collaborate. Everyone on our campus continues to get an unintentional message that Europe is important and Africa is less so, just because of the way that our history and culture has played out. That may especially affect our Black students' sense of belonging. I don't want to make too much out of this very small story. There are examples of systemic racism and other systemic inequities that are much more damaging and pernicious than the nuances of Princeton University's academic disciplines. Mass incarceration, healthcare disparities, redlining, persistent salary inequities that affect women disproportionately, anti-LGBTQ legislation. Systems are serious. Long-term, they do far more harm than any individual acting with bias or malice. Or, using systems effectively can create more progress than any individual's positive actions. Diversity and inclusion, personal and systemic. Hold these thoughts because we will return to them. I now want to do something that we don't often do on days like this one. I want to admit to the elephant in the room. This work is hard. It is genuinely hard. It can be deeply discouraging, frustrating, and infuriating. I've said it. You now have permission to feel it. Too often, we fill spaces like this one with platitudes about how wonderful the work is, how fulfilling it is, and that can leave us nodding and performing while secretly feeling that we are failing if we find it hard. But it is hard, so let's explore why. These headlines are all real. They are recent examples related to diversity, equity, and inclusion controversies in my field of higher education. Colleges and universities are a site for conflict around diversity and inclusion because colleges and universities are cultural bellwethers and they shape access to social mobility and privilege. It is for that reason that segregationists fought so hard to restrict access to higher education and civil rights activists fought so hard to increase it. It is also for this reason that activists today still fight to restrict or expand access to higher education. I am strongly in favor of expanding access, which is at risk right now. Many of you, however, work in other settings than higher education, and you also experience diversity and inclusion as challenging. Why is that? Here are some reasons. 1, American and global demographic and cultural norms are changing very fast. This includes quickly changing populations, vocabulary, social trends, and understanding of identity. Things that happen quickly are stressful and are sometimes poorly thought out. 2, our environment is highly politicized, and politicians across the spectrum have an incentive to provoke the most intense partisan reactions. 3, at all levels of government, from school boards to federal, there are also a range of bureaucratic and compliance hurdles. And don't get me started about lawsuits. 4, we live in a time of hyperbolic opinions, often poorly informed and shaped by social media, echo chambers, and confirmation bias. 5, the media itself is complicated. The mainstream media looks for the most interesting, not the most typical stories, which creates exaggeration. Social media is painfully full of fake information and is engineered to steer people to the most polarizing content. Social media also inflames group reaction and incites pile-ons. 6, we live in a country with contradictory understanding of free speech. 7, hate crimes and bias incidents are up dramatically. Hate, bias, racism, and other isms are still very much woven into the fabric of our society. 8, systemic inequities can be hard to perceive and identify, so they're confusing. And 9, all of these stressors are intersecting with other stressors, like wars and a pandemic. So based on all of this, none of us should be surprised that this work is hard. Our identities are deeply rooted in our experiences. They matter to us. That leads us to feel personally invested and/or challenged by diversity and inclusion in a unique way. Most aspects of our professional lives are about doing business in a way that does not feel so personal. So this sounds pretty depressing, right? But acknowledging the obvious is better than pretending that it's easy. Here, today, we don't need to perform for each other. Our shared work is intense, complicated, and messy. You have permission to acknowledge that. Yet, our identities, our interactions, and the communities we build are also the sources of strength, joy, belonging, discovery, growth, and stimulation. So why should we invest in diversity and inclusion in our workplaces and organizations, even if it is challenging? We are here at a Mercer Chamber of Commerce event, and in a business context, the case for diversity and inclusion is well researched and the data are compelling. For companies, research shows that diversity is a strategic competitive advantage that enhances reputation, improves innovation, increases teamwork, productivity, and access to market share, and improves hiring and retention. It contributes to a broader range of contacts and information sources. And remember that diversity can take many forms, including age, gender, race, life experience, disability, LGBT status, family, income, and more. In our complex modern world, progress and innovation depend less on brilliant lone thinkers than on groups working together. Research shows that the best group decisions and predictions are those that capitalize on the unique strengths and perspectives of the individual members, although more conflict will probably be generated along the way. Just to demonstrate this point, here are a few examples of recent research from the for-profit world, as collected by McKinsey & Company. I'm not going to read them, I'm going to let you read them so I can stop talking for a moment and let you take them in. At the demographic level, America is always changing. If our organizations do not keep up with it, we miss out on it. For us in higher education, this last data point is a particularly relevant one because our mission focuses on young adults. Of course, this data point focuses on race and there are many types of identity-based data that we pay attention to in higher education. We are also seeing very fast-moving demographic change regarding queer identities, religious identities, and students with disabilities, including those with mental health and psychological disabilities. The key is to identify the business case that connects to your mission, and then focus on investing in diversity and inclusion in the ways that amplify the missional results for your organization. To use Princeton's mission as an example, this is Princeton's mission, or part of it, we focus on the value that diversity and inclusion add to the teaching, learning, and research environment. This is a general statement of how diversity and inclusion connect to our mission. However, different offices within the university focus on different aspects. At the School of Engineering, they pay attention to drawing on life experiences, testing hypotheses, improving problem solving and innovation, and stimulating classroom interaction. In our student life spaces, we're focused on developing cultural competencies, enhancing citizenship skills, and building resilience. In the Office of Finance and Treasury, they are focused on improving problem solving and innovation, but also on seeking competitive advantages. In addition to the business case reasons why we should value diversity and inclusion, it is also appropriate to think about them as simply a matter of values. America is a country that aspires to treat all its citizens fairly and create equal opportunity, and yet we know that it has never done so. When we are intentional about seeking to be our best, most diverse and inclusive organizational selves, we are also seeking to address systemic inequities that have undermined and marginalized some of our own citizens and granted benefits to others. At Princeton, we are clear. We care about mitigating past inequities because it is in keeping with our values of community building, truth-seeking, and fairness. The university does this in ways that are legal and appropriate, of course, but when we identify systems that are inequitable, we try to fix them. And we always have more to do. If we want to be successful at diversity and inclusion, what is required? As Frederick Douglass reminds us, aspirations and good intentions don't get us very far. Action makes the difference. So in this part of our time together, I want to hone in on impact. Systemic actions are ultimately more efficient and impactful, but I don't want us to underestimate the importance and necessity of starting with the personal, and combining the two leads us to impact. First, we have to break ourselves of any notion that diversity and inclusion will just happen if we have good intentions. We make progress only through commitment and purpose, not through good intentions. As a personal matter, we have to resist the temptation to fall back into the idea that avoiding conflict or discomfort or not seeing difference should be our goal. We all recognize difference. We cherish the differences that make us who we are, and we need to be purposeful in moving to action. At the same time, we have to practice the discipline of extending good faith to others. As Justice Sotomayor reminds us, we must open ourselves up to others with graciousness and curiosity. I'm not suggesting that you should not have boundaries. You do not have to tolerate truly hateful behavior, and in fact, it is worth learning skills to interrupt such behavior. But if we want to reap the benefits of a diverse environment, then we are going to have to practice the discipline of keeping an open mind, accepting the possibility of conflict, extending grace to others, and assuming that they bring something meaningful to the table, even if we don't like it or don't get it. I personally believe that the claims about cancel culture are overrated. The media absolutely hyperventilates about this happening on college campuses. But in my experience, wherever people fall on the political spectrum, most are not trying to shut down other people. I don't want to claim that it isn't happening. I find attempts to censor books disgusting, for example, but most people are open to learning. The place that we all start learning is through self-awareness. You will get unsettled or exhausted if you are not sufficiently grounded in yourself. As Nelson Mandela says, we start with ourselves and work outward toward the systemic. How many of you have seen this image before or one like it? I figured probably a large percentage, most of the group. It proposes that we are like icebergs, with some aspects of our identity and experience visible to others above the waterline, but most of what makes us who we are not visible to others or below the waterline. This is where self-work starts, with an honest inventory of who you are, the experiences and perspectives that shape you, and how you prioritize them, recognizing that who you are may not match what people assume about you. To use myself as an example, I'm a black woman from a mixed race family. I don't look like what most people think a black person looks like. For many people, their race or ethnicity is visible above the waterline. For me, less so. But the way that I have been shaped by my family's history of discrimination and the joy that I take from black culture, those may not be instantly visible, but they are shaping who I am and how I show up in the world. I'm also a mom, which you can't tell by looking at me, but that experience drives pretty much everything about my life priorities. If you have never gone through the exercise of inventorying yourself before, I encourage you to do it. And if you have done it, I encourage you to do it again. It benefits from a periodic refresh, partly because your priorities change over time. And as well, it is an opportunity to remind yourself that everyone you encounter is also an iceberg of experiences and intersecting identities. Just as you are not fully visible to others, they are not fully visible to you. And this is why you want to start mostly by assuming good faith. Others are not fully visible to you. Once you begin practicing self-awareness, and it is a lifelong practice, you can begin to think about building competencies: awareness of unconscious bias, bystander intervention, community and cohort building, resilience, stronger understanding of key concepts and vocabulary, and so forth. I'm not going to talk more about those today, but some of the other sessions will. I will just point out that all of these skills and competencies make you a good leader. As we talk about impact, I want to stress one final point. Accountability matters. Good intentions are not the same thing as actions, and further, it is possible to spend a lot of cycles on activities that are not impactful. This becomes especially critical as we try to move ourselves from an exclusive focus on the personal to a focus on the systemic. Measurement and public progress reports are a huge organizational tool for accountability and impact. Partners are also responsible for holding you accountable. So use this day to identify your partners. Throughout this presentation, I've tried to offer a framework that maps the contours of diversity and inclusion work. It can be personal or systemic, focused on diversity or inclusion, inward or outward facing. It's a lot to take in. So I encourage you to begin using a lens that helps you assess and prioritize what you are taking on and its impact. This matrix proposes that diversity and inclusion are closely related but also distinct categories of action. I've put personal competencies and systemic actions on the other axis. What kind of activities could you undertake that would fall into each of these quadrants? In the top left quadrant, what would be an example of a personal engagement with diversity? That could be seeking out and learning about unconscious bias, even experimenting with the implicit bias test options available online to discover where you might have biases that you're not aware of. Those biases could be influencing how you view job candidates. Systemically, in the lower left quadrant, a way to improve the quality of your job candidate pools, and thus possibly the diversity of your operation, would be to strengthen the language of job postings and advertisements to make sure that you seek the widest possible range of candidates. I was struck in hearing Jennifer talk about NRG, that's one of the things that they have done. A personal activity at the top, a systemic activity at the bottom, both of which could help improve the diversity of people within your organization. Another example, you can practice supplier diversity, which is an outward-facing activity, personally by buying your books from a bookstore owned by women or people of color instead of Amazon. Systemically, to the degree that you have a say in organizational purchasing, from catering to office supplies to legal services, you can work with colleagues to seek out minority-owned firms or those that demonstrate a commitment to diversity, hiring, and leadership. Let's switch to the right two quadrants focused on inclusion. Suppose you see someone being harassed or experiencing a microaggression. Personally, in the moment, you can use bystander intervention tools, which are easy to learn and which seek to support and respond. Systemically, in the bottom right quadrant, organizations should have strong policies in place for responding to workplace bias, discrimination, and harassment. Does your organization have those policies? Would people know where to find them? A personal inclusion action would be to use people first language, which focuses on making sure that people with disabilities aren't labeled with their disabilities. Systemically, providing full equitable access for people with disabilities involves making sure that your business spaces and websites are accessible. As you encounter ways to engage in diversity and inclusion work, explore all these quadrants. Are you thinking about diversity and inclusion? Are you thinking about how you can enhance your own competencies and how you can support systemic change? As you set your priorities for yourself and participate in your organization's diversity and inclusion growth, you want to be routinely hitting all four quadrants. If all you are doing is professional development for yourself, but no one is paying attention to systems, the systems will undermine progress. If you only pay attention to getting a greater diversity of people in the room, but don't pay attention to the inclusive culture, you will lose the people. So you need all four quadrants. And pace yourself. As John Lewis reminds us, we are in it for the long haul. Diversity and inclusion are not instant gratification businesses. They require sustained attention and vigilance. Expect that, set your expectations on that, and keep showing up. We have reached the end of our journey, or at least my formal presentation. So let's sum up. Diversity and inclusion, the building blocks of belonging, undergirded by equity, are hard work. Social justice work is hard work. Diversity and inclusion are also worthy and necessary work that makes you a better community member and colleague, make your organization more efficient, and support the well-being of others. Your challenge and obligation is to keep moving forward. I've tried to offer you a framework that encourages you to think about ways to take action personally and systemically, and I hope you will find it helpful. Some parting thoughts. We have talked about the importance of being intentional and personally accountable. Once again, I challenge you to use this day to commit to something new or recommit with renewed energy. You will slip up, we all do, but keep going. Your odds of carrying out your diversity and inclusion commitments go up dramatically if you are working with others. Especially when it comes to systemic projects, you will need other people. Besides, as research shows, working with other people will make you all better problem solvers. I haven't used our time together to teach you skills. We've stuck with some pretty basic concepts, although I hope you heard something new along the way. There are many opportunities to learn more ambitiously and deeply, including throughout the rest of the day. Do your homework and your self-work, and it will make you a better leader and colleague, as well as a more culturally competent person in every part of your life. Decide where your boundaries have to be, of course, but also open yourself up to the core value of diversity, which is that you can learn from and with others who are different, even people whom you disagree with. Change requires sustained, disciplined commitment. Show up every day. And when you accomplish something, go on to the next challenge. And one final parting thought. I find great joy in my work. I get to spend time with remarkable people. Over time, I get to play a small part in seeing my institution change for the better. We look for opportunities to celebrate. We laugh a lot. Sometimes it is dark humor, but we do laugh. A sense of belonging should make life more fun. So find that, and let that be your rocket fuel. Being with you today is a joy. Thank you very much. Put it in front of leaders. These are also areas where you have to do the measurement yourself. So if you don't have climate data, if you're not surveying your employees in some way, it depends on the size of your organization, but if you're not doing that work, if you're not actually looking at your hiring pools, if you're not looking at the levels of the demographics across your staff, in other words, you're not gathering quantitative data, then you just keep going, because then people rely on anecdotes. I used to hear for years, I'm not going to name the person, but a story that it was really very difficult to hire women faculty members because of their spouses, and there was a whole narrative. And then when we looked at the data, I went back to the person who told me that and said, you know, we just don't see that in the data. Could you tell me about that? And he said, oh, well, maybe it's not true. But we had spent years hearing this over and over again as the reason we couldn't make progress. So you have to start somewhere with gathering your own data and being willing to look at yourself. That's the best advice I can give you, but it is hard, and it becomes it's a default mechanism to say that we've already been trying and it's hard to do better.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the amazing presentation. Gus Penaranda, I have a question about that you just mentioned data. So, at least in this particular state, without true, reliable data, most people will believe whatever it is that they find on Google or whatever search engine they use. As an LGBTQ member, there is very little, if any, reliable data for our community in the state of New Jersey. So I pose the question, which you mentioned about, seeking and finding and working with partners. Is Princeton University, or would Princeton University consider looking into the possibility of a true, genuine data collection for the LGBT community in the state of New Jersey?
Great question. I can't speak officially for my faculty colleagues, but I think we are very open to and eager to be partners, and often really appreciate suggestions like that one. So if you would find me afterwards, maybe we can connect. Because there are lots of ways. We have a lot of research capacity, and we have grad students, for example, who are eager to have really interesting projects that have real world implications. So that's the kind of thing where if we can identify an opportunity that would be helpful to us, selfishly, as well as others, we'd like to look for that. So in fact, I welcome those kind of suggestions from any of you.
I just want to say, excellent presentation. Brahim Knight, New Jersey Department of Labor Workforce Development. I'm the D&I officer. And something that just really connected with me, which you stated around understanding the ROI. And you just said, without that survey data, we launched a diversity climate survey. And the data was astounding. And I think the real ROI is truly looking at that qualitative analysis, right? As it relates to experiences. And you can also do a quantitative thing when you look at a year-over-year data analysis as well. So I just want to bring that to the forefront, because I think if you use that climate survey, that really mitigates your own implicit bias going into this, thinking areas that you need to work on. And then you can present that compelling argument to the organization and say, we need ERGs. We need to start making sure we have lunch and learns. We need to make sure we have a gender neutral bathroom. We need DEI mandatory training. So I just want to just bring that to the forefront, because like you said, I think the anecdotes and the philosophical arguments are what organizations use to dismiss this and say it's not necessary. So I just want to commend you on that.
Amen. I'm right with you.
Echoing again, wonderful presentation, Krista Fieselman from LabCorp. So I guess my question is about compromise, because sometimes the people who may be saying anecdotal evidence or who may be kind of having the loudest voices in the room, who are not looking at data, are individuals who are at the highest levels of the company. How would one kind of, at using their agency from any level in an organization, utilize compromise to promote D&I?
Yeah. I think we are in a world right now where compromise and pragmatism are sort of out of style in this space. Like, everybody is just a fiery activist, no compromises. But if you're actually going to make progress, you have to be prepared for pragmatic compromises. And I have learned so many times, sometimes it is not the hill to die on. Sometimes you need to learn to stay to fight another day. So being prepared to be incremental, to be iterative, to keep showing up over and over again is actually really the core of the work. If you're, if we go in expecting that we're going to have amazing victories quickly, we don't, and then we feel exhausted and frustrated and discouraged. But in fact, everything takes time. I've been doing my job at Princeton for 11 years, and there has been actually some pretty remarkable change in 11 years. But it did not happen overnight, and we still have so much more to do, so much more. So I think, wherever you are, you have to pace yourself, and you have to accept that actually making progress means sometimes you take what you can get in that moment and you show up again the next day. And the kind of absolutist approach that's out there in social media, where you have to be all this or all that, is just not how the work really happens. It happens in relationship, it happens in many, many conversations, it happens over a long period of time. So you have to expect that rather than view that as a failure.
Hi, my name is Joshvina Shah. I work with Big Brothers, Big Sisters in Mercer County. This may be a completely pointless question, but it's kind of been in my mind during the presentation, and I'm always kind of trying to anticipate potential roadblocks, especially when you're working on the systematic side. So you mentioned that there's no pushback against having a Department of African Studies. So how come it hasn't happened? Is my question.
Right. We're working on it. This also goes to the complexities of bureaucracy, which is that faculty have to organize themselves, and they have to put forward proposals, and they're already organized in disciplines. And so, in other words, it is in no way anybody trying to stop the African studies. It is that the work of the way the university works, bureaucratic wheels grind very slowly when the faculty is involved. So we are working on it. But then they're setting their priorities, and they are focused on some other things, and so we're piecing it together, and you try to move it forward. To create an academic department at Princeton takes about a decade, usually. Because the faculty have to organize themselves and take the lead in that. The president doesn't impose that. The administration doesn't impose departments. So it's a perfect example of, you can sometimes see that something is a weak spot. The president has identified it and talked about it in a letter as being an example of the way systemic racism has shaped something at Princeton, and yet it's not easy to get it corrected. takes 3 or 4 years to recruit a faculty member at Princeton. So, even things like finding and building a program is time consuming. So, yes, I use this example with caution because every time I do, someone asks and says, well, why aren't you fixed it? I said, we're trying. We are trying. But yes, these things do take a lot of time sometimes.
Okay, we have time for just one last question, if there's anyone. And if not, and I'm looking around. Oh, wait a minute. Where?
In front.
Oh. Oops.
If I don't get to talk with you now, be sure and catch me at the break, please. I'd love to talk.
And you'll be at the lunch, right?
Yes.
All right.
Hello, again, I want to echo sentiments of everybody else. Wonderful presentation, took a lot of notes. My name is Chantel Fitzgerald. I run my own business called Mindset Strategies, and we have a leadership development institute for Black women. My question to you is, what are you most proud of when it comes to your work at Princeton?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. And I can't answer it with just one thing. I think what I am most proud of is that when I arrived 11 years ago, diversity and inclusion were things that people thought were nice in theory and that I was supposed to take care of. And including a sense that sometimes they were like a problem to be managed, like, students are a problem to be managed, so could you, keep them from getting activated over some identity issue? That has really, really changed. The university has figured out how much it improves what we do on every front if we do well at diversity and inclusion. And it has gone from being my job to being something that is genuinely a lot of people's job. And I will say, when national events overtake you, people get more motivated than they used to be, right? And that's fine. I'll take it, whatever form gets people motivated, I'll take it. So we have actually really changed in our mindset, in our sense that this is something that we're really excited about, that makes us better, and we are putting a lot of money into it. And by the way, you have to put money into this, or you won't actually, it's very hard to make progress if you don't actually invest real dollars. So now we're seeing this flywheel that was turning slowly and laboriously, it's now going really fast. And we're able to get so much more done than we were a decade ago. So all the individual successes that I could describe to you, it's really about the culture change. That is what has changed.
You know what? We do have one. I'm going to get this next question in.
Okay, let's do it.
Who was it? Where was it?
Got it in front.
Okay. Barbara.
See, I forgot the question now. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful. So you mentioned that with systems, I wrote it down, you said sometimes systems do more harm long term, and we have to recognize that it's important to change those systems. So my question is, can you talk very briefly about when you're in an organization and they have systems that are problematic, such as how they promote people and how marginalized folks are still on the back end of that? Can you talk a little bit about what some strategies are in helping that organization recognize that their system is problematic when they're still saying, no, everything is fine. We have an affirmative action program. We looked at the data and there are no challenges with it.
So one thing that I recommend to you, it's a great exercise, is to take that iceberg exercise and do it with a team of people focused on organizational culture rather than on personal identity. It's fascinating how much surfaces around what people know is really the reality of the organization below the waterline compared to what it says is its values above the waterline. So much is being shaped by norms, insider information, insider knowledge, systems that no one has actually interrogated or has interrogated with a D&I lens. So I agree with you. I think it's a really, really tough challenge. At the university, for example, we went through a process beginning in 2020 of looking at all of our benefits. We have a really all kinds of really interesting, generous benefit packages. But we went through them specifically with a D&I lens. Like we said, this is a process. We're going to go and look at each one. So for example, we figured out that although we have generous tuition benefits for employees, they were mostly being used by higher income employees because of the way they were structured. We figured out that we have very generous commuting benefits, but our lowest paid employees weren't accessing them in terms of getting a subsidy for their commute because you had to put the money in up front and then wait to be reimbursed. So things like that are inequities built in where until we actually said, why is it that our low-income employees don't access their commuting benefit? And then went and started asking people that we could figure out that they weren't accessing it because they couldn't afford to pay for the $400 special train ticket up front and then wait to be reimbursed 90 days later. That's not a problem if you're a higher paid employee, but it is if you're living paycheck to paycheck. So we had to figure out how to reverse our policy in order to make it equitable. Those are the kind of things that you have to do, and it actually means you don't find those things just, sometimes you find it by chance, but you mostly find them because you were really, really intentional about looking for them. And sometimes you find that there's nothing to find. But if you don't actually do it with intentionality, you won't find anything. Because the system worked great, it just wasn't working equally great for everyone, but you couldn't tell that. So I'll leave you with that example. I look forward to more conversation in the course of the day. Thank you very much.